Alright, what's poppin' YouTube? So, we hit 100 subscribers. Not that impressive really, but it's the first proper channel milestone. So, instead of getting a high effort video, instead you get a more personal video. You can learn a little bit about me. And today we are doing my top 10 books of all time. I mean, I guess these are the top 10 I could think of off the top of my head. So, some ground rules for what I'm exactly doing this on. These aren't like the 10 best books I've ever read. These are probably my 10 favourite books I've ever read. And another note here really is that series are kind of difficult. If there's something I like that's a series that I really like, I don't know, Harry Potter's a good example. Love that series, would definitely be my top 10 series of all time, but there's not one singular Harry Potter book I could pick out to, that I think is noteworthy enough. So that's when it comes to series. If there is a book in a series that I feel is noteworthy enough on its own, I'll include it. But maybe when I hit 500 subscribers, we can do my top 10 series of all time. But let's just get into it. So number 10 is one that I think is a surprising one. Probably for a lot of people will be surprised by. I know I was surprised when I put it here. But I was thinking about it and I realised that this book is probably worthy of mentioning. And I think it's very underrated. And that's The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, the first one. I read this when I was about 12, I think, shortly before the film came out. And I think this book actually gets kind of lost in the shuffle because there was a lot of trash that sort of was released around the same time as it, like The Maze Runner and Divergent and stuff like that were quite bad. But I feel that the first Hunger Games especially, but even the whole series, like when taken as a series, but we're not talking about series now, but the first Hunger Games on its own is quite a good book. It's fairly well written. It's the character work is pretty good for the most part. The world building is fantastic. And it has that sort of timeless commentary and speculation that I think is really carried with it along. Like, it's really aged quite well. The capital is relatively believable, actually. The whole idea of, like, reality TV, like murder sports, is fantastic dystopian world building, and like the capital in general, their fashion sense. I mean, just look at the Met Gala. It looks exactly the same. The whole idea of having the tiered districts, everything just kind of works, and I don't know, it's just a fun book, I think. And I don't know, like when I was trying to pick number 10, a lot of books went through my mind, and I said, you know what, The Hunger Games. I think The Hunger Games is seriously underrated and is an interesting choice, but yeah, I think it's deserving. And this is my personal opinion, so yeah, The Hunger Games. I wouldn't even say this book has influenced me that much. I just think it's a solid book. Okay, moving into number 9 is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I didn't really know what to put for number 9, so this book I just saw it on my bookshelf and was like, oh, that's a pretty good book. So this book is quite good. I will probably be doing a video on it at some point. It's old, it's relatively easy to read. I don't really have much to say on it. I think it's just quite a good little book with a solid theme, and it's a great little window into sort of upper class British society of the time. It's relatively not much to talk about here. I just think it's a pretty solid little fun book, and I would recommend more people read it. So yeah. Now, here we're getting into books that I actually think are good. So number 8 is Dracula by Bram Stoker. Dracula's fantastic. Definitely deserving of in my top 10 favourite books. I was a kid when I read Dracula just because I liked vampires and stuff. I thought I'd read like one of the OGs. And I don't know, I was just enthralled by this story. It's quite long. It's not even that well written, really. But there's something about it. It's got such character. The characters themselves are great. Dracula's fantastic. Like, just the whole thing. It's just such a fun story. Van Helsing is a great character. Quincy Morris is an absolute chad. Like, this is the quintessential... This is the quintessential vampire book. There is no reason to read any other vampire book other than Dracula. It just has everything. It is the bedrock for vampire fiction and a lot of horror fiction. I mean, you gotta read it. And the fact that this kept, like, 11-year-old me's attention, or I might have been 13, actually, I can't remember the exact age it was when I read Dracula. It was pre-high school. So, I don't know. Dracula's great. It's just such a fun book. And I think it's very deserving of being in a lot of people's top books. And once again, this one didn't influence me that much. But I don't know. I like it. It's a great book. Moving on. Number 7 is Sandman, Volume 4, Seasons of Mist by Neil Gaiman. This is one I was apprehensive to put on the list because it's not a book necessarily, it's a collection of comics. But Sandman is... I don't think it's my favourite series. I think The Dark Tower has to take that. But it's definitely up there. I love Sandman. I have like all the Sandman books. I've read them all twice through. It's just beautiful. Absolutely beautiful, epic. But Seasons of Mist is the one for me that really sold me on Sandman. Like, the way that Sandman sort of goes to me, Volume 1, Preludes and Nocturnes, is a bit rough. Doll's House is great, but I find the ending's a little bit too abrupt. But Doll's House is good. Then Fables and... No. Dream Country, sorry. Is kind of pedantic, and there's not much going on there. Seasons of Mist is where the story really sort of gets kicked in. You meet all the Endless except for Destruction here. That opening scene where they all get summoned by destiny is what sold me on Sandman, really. You get Lucifer leaving Hell. For those of you familiar with the Netflix Lucifer show, this is what that was originally based on. And it's just a great little story, and it really brings in so much stuff from Sandman. Like, you get the Nala plot, you get the whole, everyone's trying to get hold of Hell. It's like a proto-American gods in a lot of ways. You got Odin, you got Loki, you got Thor, you got so much stuff happening here. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. It is one of the most straightforward of the Sandman stories, I think. Now, I'm kind of cheating by putting this here because this doesn't stand alone. You can't just pick this one up and read it, but I don't know. I had to put a Sandman on here somewhere. That series, I love that series. It's influenced me greatly. It truly is one of... I think it is the greatest comic book series of all time. And it was either this or Overture. But I went with Seasons of Mist just because, to me, Seasons of Mist is more special. It's the one that really hooked me on Sandman and got me to just devour the whole series, really. Fantastic, fantastic, fantastic. Moving on. Number 6 is The Gunslinger by Stephen King. This book is probably the singular biggest inspiration for me coming out of my teenage years. I think I read The Gunslinger when I was about 18. It's quite clunky, actually. But there's just something so beautiful about how simplistic it is. Just the gunslinger chasing the man in black, meeting Jake, the fantasy western thing. It's really cool. And this is one of those books that influenced me greatly. For those who've read All Hail the Carrion King, you'll know there's a lot of Dark Tower inspiration there. But that whole sort of walking across the destroyed old world, the lone gunslinger type, I don't know, I just love it. It's so great. It's such a good vibe to it. It's very archetypal. Roland Duchaine is my favourite character in anything. The Gunslinger is my favourite character of all time. The Man in Black is also one of my favourite characters of all time. And I don't know, it's just simple. It grabs your attention. It's just a really good book. And you don't even really have to read the rest of The Dark Tower necessarily to understand this one. I mean, you should, but you don't necessarily have to. And really, yeah, like, I've wanted to try and write my own Gunslinger so many times. I just can't, because you're just ripping off the Gunslinger every time you go to do it, and it's just such a good story. Really, really good. I love this book. To no end. It's quite short. I'd recommend everybody read it. It's just such a good, solid little fantasy story. Now, the top 5. Some of these could probably be switched around in order, but I'm going to say for my 5th is Watchman by Alan Moore. Now, Alan Moore is insane, but the guy is the greatest comic book writer of all time. I know I said Sandman's my favourite comic book series, it is, but Alan Moore is by far the best comic book writer. Watchmen is... It's hard to put into words how good Watchmen is, really. It's got everything. It's a solid, complete story in one go. You can just read Watchmen and it's done. You don't have to get any of this bullshit, like, tie-ins and reboots and spin-offs. Like, it's just done. I know they did, like, the Before Watchmen, but I've heard that's mostly pretty bad. I think my favourite superhero is in Watchmen with Rorschach. But the story is just so good, and it has one of the best twists. One of my favourite twists, anyway. I did it 30 minutes ago. I'm not going to spoil it here exactly what that means, but for those of you who've read it, you know what I'm talking about. It's an amazing superhero story on its own. The world building is fantastic. But it's a great superhero story, but it's also a great satire of the superhero genre, a great deconstruction of the superhero genre, but it's also a great satire of just Cold War America. And I don't know, it's an Alan Moore book. It's got so much going on. I can't really do it justice. You should go and read it. You can get it very cheap. Like, I got my copy for like $10 from a secondhand bookstore. Like, it's a very, very prolific book, like, to get hold of. Just really good. It's the best superhero story ever written, in my opinion. Beautiful, beautiful. They did a film, like Zack Snyder did a film. I heard it's alright. They made a big change in it, though, that I really don't think they should have, because the story doesn't make sense. And then there was like a TV show that had absolutely nothing to do with Watchman made a few years ago. But just don't ignore that bullshit. Go read the original. Even if you don't like Alan Moore, even if you don't like superheroes, I would highly recommend this. It is the greatest the greatest graphic novel ever written, in my opinion. I don't think anything's ever topped this, and probably never will. That's just the way it is. Watchmen, fantastic, fantastic. Number 4 is Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. I love this book. I sort of describe this book as being a sort of children's fantasy, but for adults. It's so whimsical. It made me feel like, I was a kid again. It's a great story. It's one of the few times I've ever finished a book and thought, wow, I really wish I'd written that. Right? Like, it's so good. And it even manages to weave in some sort of good sort of social commentary in a way that's not too intrusive. And there's going to be a video on this one coming soon, probably. But yeah, this is my favourite standalone fantasy story. This is my favourite urban fantasy story. I don't think urban fantasy will ever get past this, how good this is. It's just so intelligent, and so it just really keeps the whimsy of fairy tale fantasy with this sort of gritty, this sort of gritty urban fantasy world combined with this really whimsical kind of childlike fantasy story. It's a masterclass in fiction. One of my favorite books. I wish I'd written it. Amazing. Okay, number 3 we have Wizard and Glass by Stephen King. This is technically book 4 of the Dark Tower series, but there's a reason this is on this list. This book doesn't quite stand alone, but it basically does. If you cut the beginning and the end out, it's because it's sort of like a flashback within the story for the most part. It's Roland telling his quartet about him when he was a kid. But this is one of my favourite fantasy stories. This is probably my favourite fantasy story. The only reason that, I say Neverwhere is my favourite standalone, but this is probably my favourite not standalone. And it's an amazing, there's just something so unique about the Dark Tower's world. Where you got this sort of cowboy fantasy, where there's I don't know, it's such a cool world, and it's very long, and it's very, very drawn out, but it's so good, and I just never wanted it. I just did not want this book to end, and it's got its ups and downs. It's a tough read at times. It's got emotional, super emotional story, but it's got everything a fantasy story needs. You've got that sort of fallen angel character. You've got the sort of young and up and coming Jedi Knight type characters and the gunslingers. You've got an evil witch. You've got an evil army. You've got evil wizards. You got shootouts. You've got intrigue. It's just everything. It is the perfect fantasy story for those who don't like traditional fantasy, but you do kind of have to have read The Dark Tower. This is the best The Dark Tower ever gets. It's all downhill from here, and this is this is probably the greatest fantasy story of all time, in my opinion, which is a very hot take, but I seriously think that Wizard and Glass is almost beyond words for how good it is, and I will never be able to write anything as half as good as this story is. It's just a shame that the rest of the Dark Tower kind of doesn't live up to this story, but it's Stephen King. You never quite know what you're going to get. Moving into number 2, A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. This book is very good. I feel sort of pressured to put more literary books at the top of this list, but I read this book when I was 17, maybe? I think I was 17. I was in grade 12, so yeah, I would have been 17. And the reason is my English teacher at the time, he had this, we had to do a final project on a book. And it had to be a book that we picked from a list of pre-approved sort of books. And this is one of them. And he said, basically, nobody ever really does a Clockwork Orange. It's extremely violent. You basically need parental permission to do it if you're below the age of 18, because it's I think it's X-rated, actually, like the movie was. Fun fact, the Clockwork Orange, like the Stanley Kubrick film, was the last non-porno that was given the X rating. So that's a fun fact. At least that's what one of my film teachers told me, so I never fact-checked that. But this story is just... It's so simple. It asks such a simple question, but it just explores it in a way that I don't think any other book has ever explored it. Which is it better to be good and a slave or evil and free? The book doesn't really give us a referendum on... the book is like a referendum on that, but it doesn't give us an answer. The characters are great, but the world building is some of the best in anything. That's is this what the book's written in. It's this fake slang that exists in the world, and the whole book's written in it. It doesn't translate it for you, so you have to pick it up as you go along. It's unlike anything else. It's a proper literary experience, and I don't see many people talking about it particularly. But this is definitely absolute masterpiece. Like, absolute masterpiece of the English language, the English literature. Like, if you haven't read this book, you need to. You need to read this book. It's so good. And the number one, my favourite book of all time. This was a surprisingly easy choice, actually. And it's one that I don't know will surprise people, but Lord of the Flies by William Golding. This is my favourite book. I think this is the best book ever written. Well, not necessarily the best book ever written, but it's my favourite book ever written. And it's such a raw look at humanity, and especially British society, and the nature of man, and our relationship with religion and society. And I'm not going to talk too much about this one. I think people should go and read it. I first read this book when my mum read it to me, I think, when I was homeschooled for a bit. We did this as sort of our English project. And I liked it, and I thought, that's a cool book. And then in grade, I think it was 10, we did this one. And I read it again, and I was sold on it, you know. I was really sold. I was like, wow, this book's amazing. And I was one of the few people whose favourite book was this. People liked other books more when I was in grade 10. And I thought, no, this book is seriously good. It's got everything going for it. And I don't know. It's a tough read, but it's such a raw look at how boys would really behave if they got into this situation. Where basically the premise of the book is, during basically World War III, a bunch of British schoolboys get stranded on an island, and they have to form a society to try and get rescued. And it sort of starts to just fall apart at the seams immediately. You see the whole sort of rise and fall of a culture in this book. And a superstition and tribalism and sort of schisms and power struggles, and it's an amazing look into the human soul, the societal soul of humanity, especially men, and it's brilliant. It's brilliant. I know they've done a few film adaptations of this. There's a really old one that we watched when I was in school. That's I don't know. It's pretty faithful. It's quite hard to watch because it's so old now. I know there was an adaptation, I think, that 90s that was with like Americans, but and then they were going to do an adaptation with all women, but the problem is you can't adapt this book and change who the schoolboys are. They have to be British. I think they have to be men. This book doesn't work if you change one of those two things. They are important. Something that a lot of Hollywood doesn't quite understand now. A lot of people in creative things to understand now is that cultures are important. Cultures are different. Not all cultures are the same, right? Not all cultures behave the same way, right? You put 30 American schoolboys on that island, they're going to behave differently to 30 British ones, right? They just are. Britain is a much more hierarchy-based society. It's a much more traditional society. It's a much more disciplined society. It's a much less superstitious society. you know, that sort of, I don't know, that sort of schoolboyish kind of humour and desire for adventure never quite leaves British people as they get older in a way that it does in places like America. And it has to be boys because girls would not organise themselves like this. But I'm getting ahead of myself. None of those adaptations really happened. But it's just an absolute masterpiece. And every time people ask me, what are your favourite books? Or I try to think about what my favourite books, I always come back. I always come back to Lord of the Flies. It's fantastic. Do yourselves a favour and read it. There will be a video eventually on it, probably. But I think I'll have to reread it before I do that. And that is my top 10 books of all time. A couple of these are questionable. Like, I think Dorian Gray and the Hunger Games are questionable ones. I just couldn't think of any better books to put in this list. But yeah, so that's that. Thanks for watching if you watched this far. And thank you to everybody for 100. I think we're actually at a time of recording 107 subscribers, but yeah, this channel is moving slowly. There'll be big announcements soon coming for some author-related stuff I have in the works. But in the meantime, we're going to keep going. We're going to keep plugging with my classic book reviews, my villain deep dives. I love making that kind of content. And this, yeah, I had to find something I wanted to do. I wanted to make videos about, and I found something I want to make videos about, and what I enjoy making videos about. And I know they're not the best production quality. I know you can hear cars going by outside. I know you know, but I'm enjoying it, and I'm hoping some of the people out there are enjoying it as well. And you know, upcoming, I've got the Phantom of the Opera. I finished that about a week ago. I haven't had time to. My life's been crazy busy recently. Well, everyone's life's crazy busy, but mine's been extremely crazy busy recently. But I'm doing a video on the Phantom of the Opera. Fantastic book. I'm currently getting through Scarlet Gospels by Clive Barker. Not a great book. It's quite bad, actually, so far. And I will get into the reasons of that. So keep posted, and thanks very much, everybody. And remember, yeah, like and subscribe and share. And check back if you like old school books, new indie books, old school sort of horror, fantasy villains. That's what we're going to be about. And if you want to support the channel, check out some of my books. If you want. Yeah.